If you took two people with identical talent, identical resources, identical opportunities, and identical starting points and followed them for 10 years, you would find, without exception, without a single documented counterexample in the entire literature of performance psychology, that they ended up in completely different places. And the variable that determined which one built something extraordinary and which one stayed exactly where they started was not effort in the simple sense, was not luck in the convenient sense, was not even intelligence in the measurable sense, but something more fundamental, more invisible, and more completely within the control of every human being who has ever lived, which is the specific pattern of thinking that each person applied to every situation, every obstacle, every failure, every opportunity, and every moment of self-doubt that those 10 years inevitably contained. And today, we are going to go completely inside that pattern, the psychology of how winners actually think, not in the motivational poster sense, but in the neuroscience and behavioral research sense. Because understanding the precise cognitive architecture of a winning mind is the first step toward building one, and building one is available to every single person watching this, regardless of where they are starting from and what they have been told about themselves. Let's begin with the most foundational cognitive difference between winners and everyone else. And it is a difference so basic, so structural, that it shapes every subsequent thought, every decision, and every behavioral response a person produces across the entire span of their life. Winners have internalized what psychologists call an internal locus of control, the deeply held, neuroscientifically active belief that they are the primary cause of what happens in their life, that their choices, their thinking, their effort, and their response to circumstances are the dominant variables in determining their outcomes, not external forces, not the economy, not other people's decisions, not bad timing, not the particular hand that fate has dealt them. Julian Rotter, who developed the locus of control concept in the 1950s and whose research has been replicated and extended across thousands of subsequent studies, found that internal locus of control is one of the strongest and most consistent predictors of achievement, resilience, and psychological well-being ever identified across cultures and demographic groups. But here is the deeper neurological truth that most discussions of locus of control miss entirely. This belief is not just philosophically empowering, it is neurologically activating in a specific and measurable way. When the brain operates from an internal locus of control, it engages the prefrontal cortex's planning and agency circuits in response to challenges. It generates the cognitive question, "What can I do about this?" rather than the cognitively passive response, "This is happening to me." And the prefrontal cortex's engagement with that question produces a qualitatively different cognitive output than the passive external attribution processing of the person who believes circumstances are in charge. It produces options, strategies, actions, and the beginning of momentum. While the external locus of control produces helplessness, resentment, and the specific kind of cognitive paralysis that the research of Martin Seligman on learned helplessness so precisely describes. Winners are not more optimistic than everyone else in the naive sense. They are more agentive, which is a fundamentally different and far more practically powerful cognitive orientation. And it is one that can be deliberately cultivated through the practice of consistently asking, in any difficult situation, not "Why is this happening to me?" but What is my response? What is my option? What is the next action available to me right now? Now, let's examine the cognitive relationship that winners have with failure. Because this is where the thinking pattern diverges most visibly, most dramatically, and with the most significant consequences for long-term outcomes. The average person experiences failure as a verdict, as the external world delivering a judgment about their capability, their worth, their potential, and their right to continue pursuing the goal that the failure seems to have disqualified them from. And this experience of failure as verdict produces a specific and predictable behavioral response. Withdrawal, protection, the narrowing of ambition to avoid the exposure of further failure, and the gradual construction of a self-concept organized around the avoidance of situations where the verdict might be delivered again. The winner experiences failure as data, not metaphorically, not as a motivational reframe performed to feel better about a painful situation, but as a genuine and deeply held cognitive orientation in which the outcome of any attempt is processed primarily as information about what worked, what didn't, what needs to be adjusted, and what the next attempt should look like. Carol Dweck's 4 decades of research on growth versus fixed mindset maps almost perfectly onto this distinction, and her finding that the mindset, not the talent, not the intelligence, not the resources, is the primary determinant of long-term achievement, has been replicated so consistently and across so many domains that it now sits at the foundation of performance psychology as one of its most reliable and most actionable insights. But there is a neurological layer beneath the mindset research that makes this even more compelling. The brain's threat response system, the amygdala-driven fight or flight activation that treats failure as a survival threat when you believe it reflects permanent incapacity, releases cortisol and shuts down prefrontal cortex function, literally reducing your cognitive capacity to learn from the failure at the exact moment when learning is most needed. The winner's cognitive reframe of failure from threat to information is not just psychologically healthy, it is neurologically functional because it keeps the prefrontal cortex online during and after failure, maintaining the analytical capacity needed to extract the lessons that make the next attempt better than the last. Now, let's talk about how winners think about time, because their temporal cognition is one of the most consistently documented and most practically significant differences between high achievers and the general population, and it operates at a level so fundamental that it shapes almost every other cognitive difference we will discuss in this video. Winners think in longer time horizons than most people, and this is not simply a matter of patience or impulse control in the narrow sense. It is a genuinely different cognitive relationship with the future, one in which the future self is experienced as psychologically real, emotionally proximate, and continuously relevant to present moment decision-making. Research by Hal Hershfield at UCLA using neuroimaging technology found that when most people think about their future self, the brain activation pattern is similar to the pattern produced when thinking about a stranger. The future self is cognitively experienced as a different person, emotionally disconnected from the present self, which is why sacrificing present comfort for future benefit feels psychologically equivalent to sacrificing your own comfort for a stranger's benefit, which the brain is motivationally reluctant to do. But in individuals with a strong achievement orientation, in people who demonstrate the kind of consistent long-term behavioral investment that winning in any domain requires, The neural representation of the future self shows significantly greater overlap with the neural representation of the present self, suggesting that their brain literally experiences the future version of themselves as more continuous with, more connected to, and more emotionally relevant to who they are right now. This means that when a winner forgoes a short-term pleasure in favor of a long-term investment, passes on the immediate gratification to make the difficult discipline choice, they are not performing an act of heroic self-denial. They are making a decision for themselves, for a future self they experience as genuinely and emotionally present, rather than for a stranger they feel abstractly obligated to consider. And building this psychological continuity with the future self through visualization, through journaling about future goals in the present tense, through the practice of regularly consulting the values and priorities of the person you are becoming, rather than just the preferences of the person you are right now, is one of the most powerful and most underutilized cognitive tools in the entire psychology of achievement. Let's now examine the winner's relationship with discomfort, because this is one of the cognitive signatures of high performance that is most observable from the outside and most misunderstood by those who haven't developed it themselves. Winners are not people who experience less discomfort than everyone else. This is a myth that the highlight reel of public success perpetuates relentlessly, and that the reality of high performance consistently contradicts. What winners have developed through deliberate exposure, through the repeated experience of surviving and growing from discomfort, through the cognitive reframe that we discussed in relation to failure, is a different interpretive relationship with the sensation of discomfort itself, where the average person experiences discomfort as a stop signal, a neurological instruction to retreat to familiar, comfortable, lower demand territory. The winner has trained their cognitive system to interpret the same sensation as a direction signal, as a neurological confirmation that they are at the frontier of their current capability, which is precisely the location where growth, learning, and the expansion of future performance potential are occurring. This cognitive reframe is not a suppression of the discomfort or a denial of its reality. It is a different meaning assigned to an identical sensation, and the meaning assigned to a sensation is the variable that determines the behavioral response, not the sensation itself. Neuroscientifically, this maps onto research by Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University on the theory of constructed emotion. The finding that emotional experiences are not direct readouts of physiological states, but are constructed interpretations of those states by the brain's predictive processing system, which means that the physiological arousal of challenge and discomfort is genuinely neurologically interpretable as excitement and engagement rather than threat and retreat. And winners have, through experience and deliberate cognitive practice, built the interpretive habit that consistently makes that more empowering and more performance-enhancing construction. Let's now address the social cognition of winners, how they think about other people, about competition, about collaboration, and about the relationship between their own success and the success of those around them. Because this dimension of winner psychology is perhaps the most consistently misrepresented in popular culture and the most important to understand correctly. The cultural mythology of the winner often involves a lone wolf, a ruthless competitor, someone who views every other person as either a tool to be used or an obstacle to be overcome. The research on actual high achievers tells a completely different story. Adam Grant's extensive organizational psychology research at Wharton documents that the highest performers in virtually every professional domain studied are characterized not by competitive hoarding of resources and knowledge, but by a giving orientation, a genuine tendency to contribute to others, to share information and opportunity, to invest in relationships without immediate expectation of return. And the reason this giving orientation correlates with high achievement is not altruistic mysticism. It is network mathematics. The giver builds, through consistent and genuine contribution to others, a social capital of trust, goodwill, and reciprocity that creates access to opportunities, information, and collaboration that no amount of individual capability can generate alone. The winner thinks about other people's success not as a threat to their own, but as evidence of what is possible, as a potential source of learning and collaboration, and as an investment opportunity, because the person who helped someone else win has created a relationship whose value compounds in ways that are genuinely unpredictable and frequently extraordinary. Now let's examine the cognitive habit that underlies every other winner thinking pattern we have discussed. The habit that makes internal locus of control possible, that makes failure processing adaptive rather than destructive, that makes long-term thinking sustainable, that makes discomfort interpretable as growth, and that makes social generosity feel like investment rather than loss. And that habit is what psychologists call metacognition, the capacity to think about your own thinking, to observe the cognitive processes that are generating your interpretations, your emotions, your decisions, and your behaviors as they are occurring, rather than simply being carried along by them as if they were natural features of reality, rather than constructed products of a particular psychological system. Winners are almost universally extraordinary metacognitive practitioners. They have developed the capacity, through deliberate reflection, through journaling, through mentorship, through meditation, through the honest and sometimes painful examination of why they responded to a situation the way they did, to see their own thinking from the outside, to identify the cognitive patterns that are serving them and those that are not, to catch themselves in the act of catastrophizing or blaming or avoiding or justifying, and to intervene in those patterns before they produce behavioral consequences that are difficult to reverse. This metacognitive capacity is not just philosophically sophisticated. It is neurologically powerful because the act of observing your own cognitive process activates the prefrontal cortex's regulatory function over the limbic system in a way that increases the gap between stimulus and response, expands the range of behavioral options available in any situation, and makes it progressively easier, through practice, to choose the response that serves your long-term goals, rather than the response that serves your short-term emotional comfort. And this gap, this practiced, cultivated, neurologically real space between what happens and how you respond, is not just the foundation of winner psychology. It is, as Viktor Frankl observed, from the most extreme human circumstances imaginable, the last and greatest of all human freedoms, and the degree to which you have developed it is perhaps the most precise available measure of the degree to which you are the author of your own life rather than simply its most prominent character. So here is what this entire video has been building toward: the single most important psychological truth about how winners think. the insight that contains every other insight we have discussed and that points more directly than anything else toward the practical path from wherever you are to wherever winners are. Winners do not think differently because they were born different. They do not think differently because the universe provided them with a psychological toolkit that it withheld from everyone else. They think differently because at some point, through experience, through pain, through a mentor, through a book, through a moment of clarity that arrived in the middle of an ordinary day, they developed the understanding that the quality of their thinking was something they had genuine agency over. That the cognitive patterns they were running were not fixed features of their personality, but trained habits of mind that could be examined, challenged, and replaced with habits that served them better, and that every moment of every day offered them the choice between the thinking pattern of someone who is happening to life and the thinking pattern of someone who is making it happen. That choice is available to you right now, in this moment, with no prerequisites and no minimum requirements except the willingness to make it and the patience to keep making it, imperfectly and consistently, until the new thinking becomes the default thinking and the default thinking becomes the life. Subscribe for more mind secrets.